So morning, everyone. My name is Tiaan de Wit. I'll be hosting the webinar this morning, and the I'm hosting the webinar with Musi Maimane. Privileged this morning to have Musi. Welcome, Musi.
Thank you very much, Tiaan, and good morning to everybody, wherever you may be joining us from. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so Musi, before we get going on some of the questions, there were some great questions coming in through the Q&A on the registration. The first question is, where is Musi now, since being the opposition of the leader of the opposition? I know you're living in Cape Town, and what is the appropriations committee, and what is Musi Maimane doing?
That's great, and thank you, Tiaan. When I left Parliament in 2019, I then went and spent some time during COVID, notwithstanding that during that time, just before COVID, my wife fell pregnant. So I spent 4 years trying to raise a child. So those 2 years I was working hard in raising a little baby. But along with that, I also been studying, and I just am about to complete a PhD. So that was one of the things I was doing. But I left Parliament because I thought to myself, the electoral bill, the way we vote for people, doesn't work as a system because it prioritizes party over people. It makes you vote for a party, and the party can give you anybody. So then we started a movement called One South Africa, and we took the government to court on the electoral amendment bill. And the judges heard us and ruled in our favor, Justice Madlanga delivering their judgment in the Constitutional Court, where effectively he said the right to associate to a party must also be linked to a right to not associate. So my last number of years, the reason why you had 3 ballots in the last elections rather than 2 was because you then ended up with this judgment that said independents or people who didn't want to be associated to a party could stand. When we realized that it was going to be hard for an independent to end up in Parliament, that's the reason why there are none now, we formed from One South Africa a political party called Build One South Africa. And so that political party has been operating in all 9 provinces. We've got representation now in Gauteng and in the National Assembly. And one of the things that I do now is I have the amazing opportunity as a member of Parliament to chair what is effectively the Budget Committee, which is the Appropriations Committee. That's where all decisions about where your expenditure, where the state's expenditure goes, so on issues, whether it's education, healthcare. And my job is not only just to focus on probity, which is whether the thing has been allocated correctly, but on performance. So I have engagement with departments to check with them whether in some ways they've fulfilled the mandate. If we give them 100 rands for education, let's figure out if the 100 rand has been fully spent, where it's got shortfalls. And then if you ever need additional money, we're the committee that deals with all of that. So I'm really been in the last year, have had the privilege of just leading that team that looks at all of that. And it's come into much spotlight in the recent while, thanks to the budget. So yeah, I'm now a resident of Cape Town, or at least I live here for some of the time, but I spent the bulk of my time on an aeroplane. So if you want my physical address, it's OR Tambo International. And there's a post office there if you want to send me anything.
Okay, so I think then the question is quite appropriate in the budget being in such turmoil the last few weeks and month or two, and it's back and forth, and I think it's the first time in history that it didn't go into budget speech time on time. And why was it, and also why was it postponed, and what is this whole thing with the budget hike and the VAT hike, and why was it initially a 2% hike and then eventually now a 0.5? And one of the questions that came out is, and now we're going to get to some of the questions, why initially were you against a VAT hike and then you voted for a VAT hike, and what is the whole thing with the VAT hike?
It's a great question in that it asks the questions that South Africans are all consumed with. And if you don't mind, Stian, I'm going to just spend a bit of time explaining part of the budget process because that will help everybody understand where we are in the cycle so that we clear up any confusion. So the history of South African budgeting process in the last 30 years, in the initial phase, the Minister of Finance in the early 1994, so in that first part of democracy, the Minister of Finance could literally rule with an iron fist. They could make declarations and proponents, and Parliament wouldn't be able to counter or reflect that. And so President Mandela asked the question, well, if Treasury and the Ministry of Finance have a voice, where's the people's voice? And they drafted a law called the Money Bills and Related Matters Act. That bill simply said that the budget is a law like any other, and therefore, where the people are represented, which is in Parliament, that has to have a voice and has to have a counterbalance that says, actually, we must amend, reject, or correct certain aspects of the budget so that the Minister of Finance, whilst making proposals, could ultimately then say, Parliament holds this view, and therefore this is how the law is going to be written. It would be true for any law you would try and pass in this country, whether it was the law to deal with firearms or whatever. That law goes into Parliament, Parliament debates it, changes it, and then can send it back, having heard what the people want. So that's how the system is set up. When it comes specifically to the budget, the Minister of Finance with Treasury, the Constitution empowers the Minister of Finance to table budget proposals. Now, the word proposal is absolutely vital here because on the budget that was supposed to happen, I think it was the 16th of February, the Minister of Finance proposed a 2% VAT hike. Now, I use that word because even in the budget book that you would have got, it says it's a proposal. Now, naturally, either Parliament can reject it, which I still think maybe we should not have postponed and allowed for Parliament to do the job. But because it's a new terrain, it became quite clear that actually the proposal of 2% would be rejected. And I certainly was one of those. But I also re-added my voice to say there's a process that has to be followed as per the Money Bills Act. Then the Government of National Unity met within and they worked it down to a 0.5%, which actually reflects just under 16 billion rand of revenue, additional revenue to that. Then the budget was then tabled, I think, in the second week of March. On that day, all of those proposals are then tabled to Parliament. The budget, when the Minister of Finance, and you can read any budget speech, at the end of the speech, he says, I table a number of bills. It's not just he tables the budget, the division of revenue bill, the fiscal framework, the appropriations bill, and a few, and then any special adjustments that go in. It's thick books that he hands over to Parliament for Parliament then to begin to process. And all of those follow a particular route as they go. So the first part is that within 14 days after that's been tabled, the Finance Committee has to look at what is called a fiscal framework, which gives you the broad guidelines about how the budget is going to be used, what its objectives are, what revenue instruments are going to be used. That's the first part. Then, as soon as that, it says after 35 days or 31 days after that, the Appropriations Committee then receives that fiscal framework and then can begin to make adjustments, amendments to the budget, which is the actual, what is called the Division of Revenue Bill. And then later on, we'll vote on what is called the Appropriations Bill, which says each vote, vote 1 is the President's, vote 2 is Parliament, vote 3 is Health. They go through multiple votes, and those are allocated in the appropriations. And then the last is the Taxation Amendment Bills, which then looks at how tax works. So this is scheduled in a timeline that you have to stick to, because once it has left my committee, it goes to the National Council of, it goes to be voted in Parliament, and then it goes to the National Council of Provinces. Then it comes back to the President, who then signs it into law, and only then does it begin to start. So now to what is happening with the VAT. Again, it was a proposal. which was put in the fiscal framework. When it arrived in Parliament, we then were confronted with a choice, and I say this myself, between worse and much worse. Worse would have been a scenario where ultimately, or maybe let me start with the much worse part. Much worse is a scenario where the country doesn't have a budget because we don't have a fiscal framework to do the other last parts of the law, as I've explained it. So amidst tariffs, amidst all of that, imagine if we woke up today and we didn't have a framework to speak of, which means all the processes have stalled. That would present a scenario where you are really hurtling faster than you'd like to a banana republic. So we had to face that first choice, which I think is much worse. The worst part is that I'm not convinced this budget is helpful towards the growth aspirations of the country. So we need to think hard about what expenditure cuts we can do, what additional revenue we can raise, so that we can steer the country in the right direction. So we had to accept the first part, which is the 0.5%, so that it comes to the committee. The best way to deal with a 16 billion rands revenue, and you want to get rid of that, is to cut some expenses. So we've now spent time making proposals to the Minister of Finance to say, you can cut on how you adjust the road accident fund. You can cut the allocation that's been made to the National Empowerment Fund. You can cut missions, foreign missions. South Africa's got more diplomats than, I think in some ways it's equivalent to the US, which is a lot. You can cut on whether the cabinet is big enough, and you can spend on SARS, because already when SARS have gotten more money, they've already demonstrated that they can collect more than the requisite 16.5 billion rands. Also coupled to this issue, it's not just tax that's an issue in the budget, it's the bracket creep thing around personal income, which we mustn't forget, which adds it all up to then 30 odd billion rands. So when you do those cuts and then you fund the SIU so that we can have better investigation around corruption, which is the issue. So we have made those proposals, and now we are working through adjusting the budget so that we can deal with the first shortfall. The second issue is that what additional revenue can we bring on board? Now, I speak to you because we are amongst friends and this is a webinar. So we then met with the ANC yesterday and met with a number of parties to say, one of the things that we need to adjust for, and I met with the Minister of Trade and Industry to say, you need to expand the law that says online gambling must be classed as a sin tax, and things like sports betting, etc., must be made a sin tax and levied at 6% so that you can increase the revenue you get from there. Already, their contribution is 4.6 billion. But were you to levy them at 6%, which is the same for horse racing, or for the same for tobacco, it's the same for alcohol, you could then move that revenue in the short term to about 64 billion rands. So you'd be able to get additional costs. So I say that to me now, there's better energy using the Money Bills Act, Parliament, to be able to say, here's the proposals, here's what we can do, and we can adjust the budget so that ultimately we come around to a budget that does not need VAT, but it's also slimmer and far more efficient. And the other balancing act is not to enter the country into austerity. So with all of that, to answer the personal, I am still opposed to VAT, but I could not afford to not be able to bring it so that we can have a fight about it and fight to have it removed. Now, many people, including my wife, came home the other day and said to me, Vodacom sent me an SMS to say my telephone account is going up by 0.5%, and then proceeded to tell me, I have you to thank for that. This is also domestic pressure for us to fight and get it right. So what I'm going to do now is, working with the Minister of Finance, we're trying to find the legal instrument that we can use, because there's broad agreement that we don't need the 0.5%, to find the legal way of withdrawing it now that it's been proposed, tabled, and voted. So what's going to happen now is that we will, in all likelihood, either table an adjusted fiscal framework, or either table what is called an adjusted budget, or ultimately we meet as a committee next week, Wednesday, where many of these proposals will then be formalized in law, and then we can conclude from there. So I tell you all of this because as things stand at the moment, the VAT issue is going to be something we fight against. At worst case, it probably might be something that will remain until the medium term just because of the legal impediments. And the medium term is in October. But be assured that the fight and the assault against VAT is certainly taken to heart. Given that no party now has an outright majority, it means that the other subsequent steps you cannot vote on if you can't then take the initial step. I hope that's not a political answer. It's just to give you a broad, full context to understand everything.
It's a mouthful. It's really a mouthful. But in that context, let me ask you this question then. If we think of that, and you then go and say, but the other question then a lot of South Africans then ask is, Musi, we hear that and you talk about that we need to increase all the stuff, but why then is government not then just go and say, let's fight the corruption. Let's get all the leakage out of the system. Then there's a lot more money available for government to do the work that they need to do. Why then do we need to raise taxes if we have leakage that we can get out of the system?
Yeah, I mean, I, with many other South Africans, would agree on that point. But let's also not reduce it to this year. We've had 10 years of bad governance. We've had 10 years of inflation that is corruption-led. So when goods and services for the government, when you and I want to buy a bottle of water for 10 Rand, the state can spend up to 30 Rand buying the same bottle of water just because of other inflationary costs. So we've had 10 years of this. And that's why I said, let's capacitate the NPA and the SIU. I mean, it's embarrassing that the NPA can't prosecute a straightforward case as in Amatoso, if you've been following the news, but it's embarrassing that they can't prosecute people from the Zondo Commission. So now what we're saying is, in actual fact, we've got to capacitate that. This is an important moment for South Africa. It's that the ANC doesn't have an outright majority. Now we've got to clean out. But cleaning out or digging yourself out of a 10, 15-year hole doesn't just happen in 1 year. It takes almost a requisite time to begin to fill the hole. So there's a lot of work that's happening now even as you know, the president has introduced what is now a spending reviews process that will sit between parliament and the presidency to say, let's cut wasteful expenditure. And if we can capacitate the SIU, we can achieve a universe upon which we can begin to prosecute people with corruption. But it's a long journey, and I can't say it's going to happen in the immediate. It's going to take us a while, but I think it's certainly something that we are all committed to doing. And I can assure you, one of the work that I'm doing as the chair of the Appropriations Committee is to fight hard to clean out the system, to cut out expenditure. Like, for example, I think NYDA is a wasteful and fruitless expenditure. We could ask the university to transfer that money directly to students who are coming into their university, rather than having a middle agency that does this work. So all of this work is going to be reformed in the next years. But like I said, the solutions might seem populist and quick, but it's going to take us a while. But the other thing that I want to say is, you must keep in mind that even though we've seen some change, a lot of the policy frame that we're still living under is ANC policy frame, which means that we still have to deal with some of the baggage. Whether you like the policy or not, you still have to live with it because they command 40% of the government of national unity. So I say that to mean if you want a change of course and a change of policy, you need a change of government leadership, because that will change the idea of where we go in the long term.
I think that brings us to one of the questions that was asked here, especially with the last 2-3 weeks of turmoil in the GNU, is what is the future of the GNU? And you know, you sitting in the inside rooms of what's happening currently there, is what do you see is the expected lifespan of the GNU, and are we going to win this fight? And are we on the in, or are we on the out currently?
Well, first and foremost is that coalition politics are hard work. They really are, because they require trust, they require collaboration. And our system is not set up for coalitions in this sense. in fact, our system envisaged coalitions, but it didn't plan for the practicalities of coalitions. Because a proportional system, as we vote, anticipates that there may come a point where no one gets 50%. So now you've got to merge people together and let them vote. But there are a few problems with that. The first is that it says that within 12 days after an election, a government must be set up. Now, trust me, if you've ever negotiated a merger in business or anything like that, imagine in 12 days having to agree on a government plan, elect a president, get everybody together soon after an election, and then get going immediately. I think that's a flaw in our system. Countries all over the world, Germany, who work with coalitions, give themselves much longer, a month or two, where they literally are negotiating all the issues so that you avoid these budget impasses. Because if you've agreed up front to say we're going to build a bridge and a dam and a whatever else you want to do in the economy, you've got to agree with that up front. None of that happened. So I say that to answer your question about what I think is wrong with the GNU. The GNU's biggest dilemma is that it doesn't have an organizing plan. And it's one of the things that I keep fighting for, is to say, if anyone wants to join the GNU, best you come up with a plan that everybody can work towards. The second issue is that because you don't have an organizing plan, then everybody feels that what they are doing and having to do is important, because now everybody manages their constituency. Cabinet says that you are enjoined by cabinet decisions. You can't say, well, I'm in cabinet, but actually, when I don't like what cabinet is doing, I'm not enjoined with that. So parties who have then decided to go to court and to move out of cabinet, I think to me are acting outside the spirit of what our law is. And ultimately, you cannot be part of a cabinet which you don't work with. Cabinets by themselves, a bit like when we pick a Springbok rugby team. When a try is scored for that Springbok team, you don't say, phew, that was a try for the Lions. You say that was a try for the Springboks, if your original club is the Lions. In the same way as when you lose, you don't just stand up and say, well, it wasn't us, it was the Cheetahs players and the Bulls players who are screwing it up. We were all part of the Springboks. So win or lose, you've got to deal with the same. And it's the same in the budget process. It's the same in running a government of national unity. Once you are in, the decisions are enjoining you, and you've got to focus on stability and bringing it forward. I think for practical reasons, I think now it's going to be reset. In the next 2 weeks, you'll see some reconfiguration of what the GNU looks like. And I also do think in the next year, you'll see more reconfiguration as President Ramaphosa himself has to face an election inside the ANC, and there's a local government election. So if you were to ask me what I think the life term of it is, I think it's going to be rough for the next 2 years. And I can't quite see the current configuration lasting. You probably will find that there'll be an iteration of it and a change, but it certainly can't carry on the way it is, because as one who sits, and we're not in the GNU, we're outside the GNU, but are watching the movie unfold, I can tell you that there's trauma on both sides of the argument between the ANC and the DA. And some of the issues have become quite difficult. And what we need as a country now is, rather than focused on, if you like, two adults who are fighting, I would much rather have a sort of a consolidated working government, create stability so that we can fight the external global geopolitics that we are faced up to. So I'm hoping that we can resolve the conflict sooner. And really, if people can't work together, I'd rather get a team that can, so that we can at least have a performing team rather than a team that is divided within itself. So I'm giving you timelines, 2 weeks, then 1 year.
Then what?
So what I think is going to happen is, so in the next 2 weeks, I think you'll see a reconfiguration of this thing. I know people are like, will the DA stay or go or whatever? I think that in all probability, you'll find that if they're fighting today about the budget, this budgets happen twice a year. Can you imagine having to do this exercise twice? You've got to do it in February, you've got to do it in October, and then the next year starts again. So I think that you can't keep threatening all the time to go to court or leaving. Either you do or you don't. So I suspect that in the next 2 weeks, you'll see a reconfiguration. You'll see new parties join the GNU and possibly a new cabinet being established, or one with similar that still maintains a GNU, which says which maybe with or without the DA, or maybe a reduced influence of the DA. Or if you do that, then I suspect that as President Ramaphosa heads into an election next year, that's what I'm saying, you will see a different reconfiguration at the same time, because I think for ANC's internal politics, there will be a candidate that will emerge from there who will want to fight as an anti-GNU candidate, because there's certainly enough animosity within that space. So all I guess I'm saying to you is, the best way I read the situation before me is that I always think to myself, as a father of 3 kids who happens to have been there for the birth of all 3 of them, pregnancy is nice. Holding your baby after birth is the most incredible thing. But giving birth to a child is the ugliest thing you've ever been through. Notwithstanding the pain that my wife went through, I felt I went through a lot. No, I'm joking. She suffered more. But but what I'm trying to say to you is that that process is ugly, and South Africa is going through a rebirth process in many ways. And so it's going to be hard in the next 2 years, but I think we've got to buckle ourselves, because I think what will end up at the end of that will be better for all of us. There's already a commission now that's looking to to amend the electoral bill. There's already a process in place now to say, when we go to the next election, South Africans will know kind of what they look for. And I think more than anything, the hold that the ANC used to have of Liberation Party and getting universal 2/3 election results is now over, which means that we now have to get used to a new normal, unlearn old ways. And in the unlearning, it's a tough part. Now we've got to come together to build something better and more stable for the future. So for me, that's what I'm living through. And I guess I'm watching Parliament, I'm watching the reconfigurations, and we'll get through it. I'm committed to the process, and I'm committed to staying in the room to continue the fight.
Okay, so one of the questions that came up here, it was about education, youth development, and we have a failing education system. The funding system in education is failing. We see a lot of things. Currently in Gauteng. One of the sports we have in Gauteng is ducking potholes on the roads. I know in Cape Town you guys don't have that. It's quite a fun sport we have on this side of town, but I think the question that a lot of people are asking is there hope? If you look at different segments of society, and if you look at where we're coming from, and a lot of people are leaving the country, but inside, we see fights happening, and a lot of times before the darkest times in life, there might be hope. So looking at all the signs, what you're seeing on the insides and what you've seen, the question is, looking at education, looking at things happening, looking at the signs of politics, the changes, the winds of change, is there hope, Musi?
Look, Stian, like I explained to you, it's in the midst of birth, it's ugly, but what comes at the end of it is much more positive. That's the first thing that gives me hope. The second thing that gives me hope is that South Africa's legal framework remains intact. We still have a constitution. No one is going after trying to remove that. On another day, we could have been in another country where the president says, I'll be president for life, or I will adjust the constitution. And if I've got the numbers, because here's the other danger behind the GNU that everyone sort of likes. The GNU's got 70% of parliament. Were they to vote together, that vote would be 70%, which means they could amend the constitution, literally. But no one is having that conversation. South Africans, like I explained to you, even the 12-day rule, it's inconvenient. Yet even a party like the ANC will follow that to the letter of the law to uphold it. It's even if you are the president of the country, you still appear before a court, which I think is important. In Turkey, that doesn't happen. In the US has now just recently, you can't prosecute a sitting president. So all of these things are part of something in South Africa we've got to hold on to as legacy for future generations, that Despite the inconveniences of the constitution, we've upheld it. Despite some of the laws that are hard to follow, we've upheld them. But the third thing is that South Africa's economy is just over, I think it's just under 6 trillion. And the state expenditure of that is 2.2 trillion. And I say that not to minimize anything. I'm just merely trying to indicate the fact that actually we've still got a fairly vibrant private sector, which I think the hope I hold on to is that actually in South Africa, were you to flick a few switches, South Africa is poised for growth. We are dealing with Europe at this point in time, or at least Western democracies, are dealing with negative birth rates, which means Europe is trying to figure out how it can help people have more children. China's birth rate is starting to decline. That is a genuine challenge for those economies. Africa, on the other hand, we have a positive birth rate, which means that labor is still available in our continent, which means minerals are still available in our continent. So if I was betting, I would bet on Africa, given the fact that of all the things that are happening in the world, we can benefit from a population dividend. So if I was to pick anywhere to go, and I'm invested as much as anybody else, I've got 3 little kids who still need to study here, need to create an economy that works here. But I'm hopeful because I think now that we're going through this phase where no party can govern as it wishes, that things can change in terms of legislation. Think about it this way. If there wasn't the kind of configuration that I have now in politics, actually, we would have all swallowed a 2% tax hike and nobody would even have a say about it. Because the Minister of Finance would have said, here's 2%, good luck, we'll see you on the other side. You might protest, you might run to the streets, but nothing would have changed. I'm not saying 0.5 is better. It's a bit like saying, would you prefer the death penalty or slow death? I'm merely indicating that at least there's been a reduction thanks to the fact that no one governs alone. So all of these things will need to manifest in other areas. And then, so when I talk about the few switches that we have to do, we fix our logistics as a country. I think South Africa will fly thanks to, in some ways, even when I looked at even the tariff and the commodity pricing, I think our minerals are starting to show some recovery. Yes, it's not enough, but there's still some coming. Currencies that are of developing countries, the lira, the rand, have hit headwinds. That's going to happen. If we keep the lights on, I think our economy will grow. The IMF anticipate that if we work to eradicate corruption, we can add 1% to our GDP. That is a possibility. But the most crucial one is we fix our education, because you started about that. I think this has been the biggest failure in the last 30 years, if I'm honest with myself. I think South Africa, and it's not to suggest that the education system before that was any better. I'm just saying that was the one thing we should have been more vocal about fixing. Still today, the size of your pocket decides what quality of education you are going to get. Therefore, we have to work harder at saying, how do we help fix education in that sense? And for me, when I even look at legislation like BBBEE, I would focus the BBBEE funding into saying, let's go into fixing schools. Let's go into doing the work that says that we can upend our education. One of the things that have started to even occur in the later of what's going on, even in the new energy of fixing our country, is that you can see things like even SOEs. SOEs aren't getting bailouts. We've been fighting in our committee, and I wrote in our report to say no bailouts to SOEs. There hasn't been some in the last year. What's starting to happen now is that SOEs are now having to apply for funding with what is called a BFI window or a bid window, so that they can have shovel-ready projects, and only those will get funded. So I am saying to all of us, yes, it is ugly, but there's a lot of energy and a lot of work that's going into fixing it, because I think even the ANC realizes that we don't have a spare South Africa we can roll on once this one is completely damaged. We have to work hard. So I'm optimistic, and I have to be, and I have to enter into negotiations with the optimism that says we fix our country, rather than simply saying, well, it's doom and gloom. And lastly, immigration of people going outside and coming back into the country. I don't always necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think, yes, when people leave because they're looking for economic refugee elsewhere, that's a challenge. But when young people go and explore, I mean, your NMG has been served incredibly by being founded in different parts of the world and now is able to invest in South Africa. I think immigration and being part of the global economy is not anything criminal. It's the fact that we can then harness international skills, repatriate capital, and ensure that we build businesses here. So for me, I'm more optimistic, and I know maybe my faith compels me to, but I can see that we've really had to all roll up our sleeves and get into work. That's why I don't have time to go to court or reject fiscal frameworks and do all sorts of theatrics. I'd rather really get into the work of fixing. That's what I'm doing.
Mm. So you mentioned something about triple B, double E, and so one of the questions here is it helping or hurting the economic growth, and how would you redesign it if you had that ability?
So, whenever I think about triple B, double E, let me say this one thing.
Sorry,
when someone is
sorry for interrupting you. Keep in mind your marital design.
My wife is a white South African, so I'm a 50% shareholder in that enterprise. I think she only married me because of BE points, to be honest with you. No, but I certainly think that what South Africans mustn't forget is that South Africa has a cancer. It's like a cancer patient. And the cancer is we've got multiple South Africas. If you are in South Africa A, you get quality education, you've got money, you work in an economy that works, that's formalized, all of that. If you are in South Africa B, you can find yourself living in places where the ratio of police is less, the education is poor, the transport is terrible. And some of it are hang-ups from apartheid, some of it are hang-ups because we've misgoverned the country. That cancer exists. And the sooner we heal that cancer, the more we can prosper as a country. Now, triple B, double E, in its initial conception, was a medicine we tried to prescribe to say, how do we fix this thing where others are excluded in the economy and we want for them to be included? Has it worked? It hasn't worked. But does that mean we are cured of cancer? No, which means we must try something else. So here's what we are now. We still have a dual economy. Income is still distributed on racial lines. You may disagree, the numbers bear it out. So here's what we've got to do. Is I'm of the view that we've got to take a long-term view. If I had the power to decide repeal the act, I would focus it on doing two things. I'd make contributions toward a jobs and justice fund. And what that fund does is that it funds for infrastructure in communities that are less. So let me give you a good practical example. My mother lives in Dobsonville, Soweto. The country is celebrating that, load shedding is done. But I'm telling you, people in Soweto are living under a thing called load reduction. And load reduction operates as a function of the fact that actually the infrastructure there is so old that it cannot cope. So they have days. My mother spent the last week without electricity. So that's something that you can't afford. When others have electricity and others don't, it doesn't work. So here's what I think we need to do is create a jobs and justice fund that builds into that infrastructure. But I would really direct corporate spend towards education. Down the road from my mother's house is a school. The state has the land, it has the classrooms, and it has some of the teachers. Now imagine if a company then pairs up with that and says, if a private school education is 30,000, the state already spends just under 13,200 per child per year. So if we are contributing 13,000, the land and the teachers, and we ask the parents to maybe pick up like 5,000 Rand or whatever, that's 500 Rands a month. And then through a jobs and justice fund or whatever contribution a company does, we cover for the rest. Suddenly that school upends the quality of the education and then breaks over to say, here's a quality of education for the next generation. So I would reform it to focus on jobs and justice and education. That's what I would focus it on. All of these compliance issues, the codes of good practice, the 6 chapters, I think to me become compliance nightmares that businesses cannot hold. And I think we must simplify it. We must seek to heal the cancer. But if anyone has ever had a battle with cancer, I haven't. And I hope that I don't minimize the struggle of cancer people. The healing is long and it's hard. You've got to be committed to it. You can't cheat. You can't take corners. But that's what South Africa has to do to heal this divided nation of multiple South Africas. We have to build the long term in the education and use whatever means we have to say, let's help, particularly the township economy, to say, let's zero rate it for infrastructure build so that companies can invest there. That is what the work we've got to do. And I would look at it that way in healing this very difficult problem that we face.
Mm. So I like the fact that you're saying we need to look at. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
I lost you there a little bit, Stian, so I'm not sure what you said in the last bit, but I can hear you now.
Okay. No, I said I like what you said about the education, and I think South Africa needs education. We need that urgently. One of the other questions that came out.
So, Stian, what I was wanting to say is that, I mean, I can see the benefit of what education has done for me. My mother was a cashier, my father was a factory worker. And if you educate the next generation, it changes the trajectory of their lives. And certainly, we've got to, and if you know the expenditure and if you know what you need to do to supplement education, it's not just a costing issue, but it's also that I want to encourage companies and professionals that are on this call. We've got to make it possible for professionals to serve on governing bodies of schools, even if their children don't go there. Because sometimes if you have a school in Orange Farm or in Soshanguve, the parent community there sometimes doesn't have the skills to actually hold the principal to account. But whereas if you've got an accounting firm that says, can we adopt a few schools? And as part of our corporate social investment, we're going to deploy those skills to just attend a governing body meeting which sits once a month. If that's all you did, you could help the school budget better, you could help the school fund itself better. And just that skill alone is a significant contribution to the redress and the justice conversation we can have, because the quality of the education of those children will be largely improved. The reason why ex-Model C schools continue sometimes to thrive is because they work out how they can add school fees to subsidize for additional teachers. And then coupled with that, they have governing bodies who hold their headmasters to account in a far more effective way than perhaps what happens when you find yourself in a school in Orange Farm, et cetera, where the community has suffered because of its own history, but the skill component that sits in the governing body doesn't deliver the wattage that you need to be able to transform that school.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So one of the questions, one of the attendees asked here says, the private sector truly believes in transformation and reduction in income inequality, which is worse today than in '94, which is obviously anecdotal. I'm not sure how statistically it is, but we're so tired of fronting the corruption that is enabled by BE and the ANC cadre deployment. This must end. Agree?
Look, again, I speak to the cancer question. We still have a cancer. So yes, I agree with you that BBBEE has not helped in certain aspects. What I want to confirm, income inequality has become worse. South Africa is now one of the most unequal countries in the world. We own that prize. We compete with Brazil for last place in that regard. But the second thing is even intra-race. So in other words, if you excluded any other race and just took the race itself, just took Black people just alone, inequality amongst Black people has also widened in the same period. So it tells you that we're not being aggressive at how to fix for inequality. And therefore, we need to think about how to change legislation. Fronting occurs when you ask people to fill in cumbersome, complicated issues around BBBEE. We've got to make it easier. We've got to automate it and make it such that it's focused on targeted interventions rather than it being this broad thing that can lead itself to trying to manipulate certain variables for its long term. But I must stress this, Jan. If anyone thinks there will be peace in South Africa and we keep the infrastructure or things as they are now, it's never going to work. You can't have an economy that literally is an island of wealth and a sea of poverty. It's unworkable. And again, if I speak in the financial services sector, which is where NMG is, I would urge that figure out the best ways to democratize access. And I'm glad that you are doing that with your partnership with Hurisani and the companies that you are working with. That is where you are able to work and say, can we democratize access to financial services to communities that historically never had them? And that is a partnership that ultimately seeks to say, how do we become more inclusive? It mustn't be just a compliance issue. It must be a justice issue that South African corporates own and be able to go forward. I would make it less burdensome on compliance, much targeted on what it does and what's contributory so that it's easy. And you can't fudge it, but we are all contributing towards fixing the injustice. I mean, I may not, for example, I sit here today, I have to, in some ways or another, not only just educate my own children, but educate my cousins, whatever, my nieces, all of that, put them through schooling. That's an additional tax that you have to pay. Now, I don't do it out of I don't do it out of compulsion. I do it because I realize that it's unfair that just my kids get a good education. I think that it would be fair to democratize and give access to all of them. So if you can understand it at a personal level, I think we can understand it at a country level. And there are already mechanisms now being worked on to say, how do you streamline it, make it easier? Well, if I became president of this country, this is one of the areas I just change it, make it easier, target it on education and target it on a jobs fund so that we can help entrepreneurs. I think it'll be easier than the current model as we have it.
Mm-hmm. So the one question here was, if you had a magic wand, what would you like to see happen in South Africa with respect to the economy? What picture do you have in mind?
I see an economy that at its most minimum needs to grow at 3%. To achieve a 3% growth, there are a few key projects you've got to focus on. The first is, how do we use transport as an enabler for economic growth? And this speaks to how do we integrate through, and I know it sounds ludicrous, but we found that where you build transport nodes, you can create economic activity around it. The Gautrain is an excellent example. You've seen the boom around Midrand and the building of the Mall of Africa, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying that the malls are the only thing, but when you deal with logistics in this country, you could build super trains that connect the Free State, that connect the Northwest, that connect Mpumalanga. It will broaden the economy by moving people just away from concentrated areas like Johannesburg and Sandton. It will move economic activity there. Secondly, you could then enhance through transport and logistics an easy export of commodities if you fix your ports and your rails. You could benefit from the tourism aspects of the Free State, the Northwest, plus that of Mpumalanga. So that's on one enabler that is able to do that. But the other big push around transport is that actually you make your consumers able to use public transport and not have to live in concentrated cities, but easier to travel into places of work because you reduce their burden, which is 40% of their income being spent on transport. So transport is a crucial enabler. The second is I would diversify our energy space and transition, because when you do that, you can allow for more competition and spacing to come into that. My future is that for South Africa to happen, we need to be that battery center of the world. As the world is transitioning economically, the minerals that we need, palladium, lithium, etc., are mined here, if not here in our neighborhood, DRC, etc. We are the closest hub to create the manufacturing sector to be able to be the net exporter to the world of all of those items. I would educate, because you can't grow an economy on the back of poor skills. But the last thing I'd say is build an efficient government. Our problem was not corruption. And I know it will shock people. Our problem is competence. And when you've got incompetence, corruption thrives. But when you build a competent, capable state, corruption can't work, because suddenly someone knows that a server isn't this price that the corrupter wants to sell me at. It is at this price, which is a market competitive price, that I can benchmark. Then you alleviate all the inflationary burdens that are bred out of incompetence or sometimes people who are purely committed to corruption. So I would urge that let's build the capability of the state, because I know there are some people who say, let the state get out the way, it's not going to help us. No, no, no. You don't need a state that's out the way. You need a competent state that can partner with you so that we can achieve the objectives we want. But we've got to pick competitive sectors. We've got to say to ourselves, South Africa is going to educate. You'll have the best skills here. And we've got the population to back. We've got a competent state that can work with you. And ultimately, we can ensure that in our trade, we then utilize things like the Africa Free Trade Area to be able to maximize our interaction with the 1.4 billion Africans that are coming by 2040 to provide services like healthcare, infrastructure, education, all of the basic goods that we can trade into. So I back South Africa. I think that we have an opportunity, but we need to do some basics and get them right.
Sure. So, Musi, you know, a lot of the audience that you're talking to today are business owners, and some of them are SMEs, some of them are a bit of corporates. And if you became president and you had to partner with business owners and you had to give them hope and say, hey, let's work together as a country based on some of the stuff you just said, what would your message be to us and saying, hey, let's work together? What's the recipe to take forward and partner and say, let's move forward and take this country to make it a better place for our children? What would that be?
My invitation to business in general is that I actually, you catch me on the sidelines of an SMME summit where I'm sending the same message, that you are the freedom fighters in the truest sense of the word. Anyone who wakes up in the morning to create a job in this country is taking on the role of advancing freedom. Because if you want to take away people's freedom, let them languish in poverty, because poverty robs away our freedoms and our dignity. So let me affirm that and say, I don't care what the color of the business is, if you want to put that on the table. Let's make sure our businesses aren't just good in South Africa, but they are good for South Africa. But the second thing I would say is in partnership is that, again, don't let government, you know, I sometimes find there used to be a saying that said, business has never found a government it does not like. It was true under apartheid. It is true today to some extent. I think business kind of wants to say, if you get out of our way, we'll just pay our taxes and ignore you. No, 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 no. You've got to roll up your sleeves and say, here are some policy issues that we've got to advance. You've got to understand the politics of this country. Don't pretend they don't exist. And you've got to understand the governance framework of this issue. Now, let me give you a real and a practical example. As you've said, I chair the Appropriations Committee. And I hear businesses lobbying the ANC privately, and they are lobbying people. But you don't talk to the people who can actually make the change, which is our committee. Where is businesses' submissions when there are public hearings about what some of the budgetary issues can be? They don't do that. And it becomes true even in the municipalities when things like IDPs are tabled. You are a significant contributor to say, when you talk about potholes, go fight your municipality to say, we want a better budget to fix potholes in these streets so that you can do that. The last thing I'd say is, and then also lobby for legislation that makes sense. Don't sit back and assume that government doesn't want to hear you. It does, because you have a significant role to play. Use your voice and use your collective voice to fight for it. But I would lastly invite you to say, on the skills journey, come together. And I really believe that you can help public leadership. Don't do it behind back doors. Lead forthrightly and forward. And I see some sectors, mining sector, agriculture, all of those sectors, beginning to work together to say, how do we make a contribution and how do we work with the state? There's been a great partnership in Operation Vulindlela that says private players, how do we fix rail? How do we privatize it so that more players can come on board? Let's do that. And my long-term thing is that the more we could see a thriving private sector, then we know we've done our job. If you ask me, what are my economics are simple. Move the poor to the middle class. That's it. You build a bigger middle class, the country is stable. But a shrinking middle class builds instability. So my economics are about how do we move the poor to the middle class? And the only people who can do it with great efficacy are businesses that can employ people, take them from poverty into that middle class. Because to be middle class in this country The median wage in this country is just over 4,500 rands. I think it's benchmarked at that. So when you start to move people into 10,000, 15, 20,000, you're moving them into this middle class cohort, which makes them personal income taxpayers, but also people who can invest further into the economy, whether it's in the bond markets or certainly buying vehicles, etc. So this is an opportunity. And business, be innovative. Let's find tools that don't cannibalize citizens, but rather helps them invest, especially in the financial services sector. I mean, it still disturbs me that if someone wants to buy a financial instrument, their debit orders cost them for every 1 rand 11 cents. Now that's 11%. Would you sit with an 11% tax just trying to invest? Whereas to do that for a unit trust, maybe less. Now let's create collective unit trusts that people can buy as a democratized access, and suddenly you create a financial instrument that's cheaper for people to service, but that helps them set up for long-term wealth. We can be creative about these things. And the financial services sector, you can empower citizens to make a significant difference. So my invitation to you is that it sounds cliche to say together we can do more, but I would hope to build a government that would free you up to come up with innovative products for South Africa as we have it, not as we wish we had it, or as we think we could have it. As we have it now, let's figure out the best ways to engage with it.
Cool. So last question. Okay.
I'm still with you.
I see your camera is off. Okay. Can you see me, Musi? Okay.
Yes,
there we go.
can.
Okay. Last question. Are you still gonna run for president one day?
2029, baby.
Okay, cool. Musi, thank you very much for your time.
But let me, I mean, I don't want to over-egg that last question, but what I want to say to South Africans is that if there are 60 million South Africans, 31 million of them are eligible to vote. This is for ease of mathematics. The numbers are not just quite as accurate as that. 15 million of them actually register and vote. And actually some participate, and you can see the spread that we have now. So about 10 million or so of them vote for a combination of the ANC, EFF, MK. And then the rest are split amongst the opposition. Here's my question to you. If you were competing in a voter pool of 15 million people, knowing that even if you had, in a world of coalitions, if we want to see change in this country, it doesn't take 30 million votes. It actually takes 3 or 4 million votes, and the country can change its entire direction. So I give that to you to say you don't need to do it's not an insurmountable task. 17 million people vote for idols. But maybe that's because they get to do it on their smartphones. If we want to see a different direction in this country, it will take not all of us, a few of us, as few as 3 million, 4 million, choosing a different path, and this country can change. So I'm here to encourage you to say, it's not insurmountable. I think as South Africans, we've surrendered ourselves to thinking it will always be like this. We've taken Jan Smuts' dictum that says, South Africa is a country where the worst never happens, but the best is almost impossible. We've got to come back down to saying to ourselves, actually, this is our country. And if all of us, especially the 15 million who don't vote, began to participate, this country can change. So if you want to know, my simple strategy is to talk to those citizens who are not registered, especially the young. My daughter will be a first-time voter in 2029. I would hope she'll be vote number 1 of the 4 million that we'll need. And then we can change the trajectory of this country. So I invite you to say, join the journey. I'm not here to campaign. I'm just here to tell you, you have an opportunity to be able, let's not be victims and say it will ever always be like this. No. We can get a new government that can be able to bring the trajectory of this country in a different way. And I think I've told you the story before. We've seen what happened to Zambia when there's a new government in place. We've seen what happens in the US when there's a new government in place, whether you like that or don't like it. But the reality is that politicians are a lot like nappies. Once they get full, it's about time to change them.
Mm. That's very true. That's very true. Yeah. I think there's one last question. I know we're out of time, but I think there's one last question. I think it's very, very, very apt for the time we're in. Is the everything that's happening now with the US and all the trade hikes and everything and the budgets and everything. Will all the trade hikes and everything we see, and it's a complete shift now, but do we need to be concerned with the trade hikes and the cuts of funding to South Africa? Will this have a massive impact on the South African economy? And with money not coming to South Africa, do we need to be concerned as South Africans?
Look, we do need to be concerned, and we do need to think about what new economies we can deal with. We have preferential, if you like, export rights to the US built on AGOA, right? The new tariffs just about do away with that benefit. So in essence, if I think about even agricultural products, they are now outside the AGOA cycle, which means we have to figure out ways, and you can't forego the US economy. You have to say to yourself, okay, it's the US, but less relative to others. You can pick China, but the truth is China's our trade deficit relative to that of the US. We are a net benefactor when it comes to exporting to the US relative to China. So I think we've got to be concerned, but the actions we've got to take require the following things. We've got to go strike a deal with the US. I know President Trump says publicly, everybody must is scampering to come and strike a deal. We've got to be there to strike a deal. We need to strike a deal with the US. Because the biggest crisis in South Africa, I know people want to make it VAT, but actually we've got very low gross capital formation or direct investment. So we need to up that. And the US is our biggest trading partner. We need to figure out how we do that, second biggest. And then we need to say to ourselves on the export markets, how do we deal with these things? Tariff in and of themselves are not good for anybody. I think President Trump needs to realize that they could be more disastrous for the US economy. And you would have seen what it's done to NASDAQ. You would have seen what it's done to some of their own industries. I think it limits competition and in some ways can be a dangerous rule for America. But for us as a country, given that some of our commodities and how many of our items have been hit with tariffs, we need to think about additional markets. We need to think about striking a deal with the US. And we need to be intentional about saying to ourselves, how do we not only beneficiate some of our goods so that we can be more focused on building the trade balance of net positive exports? And I think there's still markets that we don't do well in, places like India. We don't do enough of the work there. And I think there are big opportunities that face up to us right now.
Great. Merci. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. And regards to Natalie and your kids, and have an awesome day in Cape Town.
The weather's
and
amazing.
Everyone, thank you very much
and
for
the
joining
beaches
us.
are cold.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining
All
us.
right, cheers.
Have a great day. Okay, bye.